Welcome all of you. My name is Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program here at the Wilson Center. And it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this seminar on Warsaw Pact, Wartime Statutes. The Wilson Center, just for those of you who haven't been with us before, is the official U.S. memorial to Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States. As both a distinguished scholar, so far the only American president with a PhD, and a national leader, Wilson felt strongly that the scholar and the policymaker were engaged in a common enterprise. Here at the center, we commemorate the ideals and concerns of Woodrow Wilson by providing a link between the world of ideas and the world of policy, by fostering research, study, discussion, and collaboration among a full spectrum of individuals concerned with policy and scholarship in national and world affairs. Directed by former Congresswoman Jane Harman, the center hosts about 200 scholars each year and holds over 800 meetings on international and national affairs. The center's History and Public Policy program seeks to provide historical context to current public policy issues and a forum for the discussion of new, significant, and policy-relevant historical findings and publications. Many of you are familiar with our Cold War International History project, established some 20 years ago, a leading archival historical clearinghouse, in particular on evidence from the former communist world archives. We're delighted to co-host this event today with the Central Intelligence Agency's Information Management Service Historical Collections Division, which is releasing 22 documents on U.S. intelligence assessments of the Warsaw Pact war planning. These documents are in this brochure here and in the attached CD-ROM. Since the establishment of the Warsaw Pact in 1955, the anticipated reliability of non-Soviet Warsaw Pact forces in the event of a crisis was the topic of intense interest for the United States and its NATO allies, as well as for the Soviet Union. As the Soviet Union engaged in successive efforts from the late 1960s onwards to codify its command and control arrangements over the armed forces of its East European allies, first through a peacetime and later a wartime statute, the U.S. intelligence community's collection and analytic efforts on the subject were ongoing. Featuring a selection of newly declassified Central Intelligence Agency documents, today's workshop will discuss the evolving U.S. views on the relationship between the Soviet Union and its non-Soviet Warsaw Pact allies. Scholars will certainly welcome the release of these materials and the very handsome publication put out by the CIA. The documents will help enrich historical scholarship on the history of the Warsaw Pact and U.S. intelligence assessments. As Ross Johnson, a senior scholar here with the center, suggests in his preface to the collection, it is noteworthy how quickly this very highly sensitive information, Warsaw Pact information, became available in Washington within weeks, and how much, in fact, the findings in these assessments have stood the test of time, given what we know today. I think, though, this is something that we will be discussing in finer details today. Hey, Mark. You're right here. Wonderful. We have a complete panel. Having said that, I think it is important to also point out that appreciating and debating the full significance and impact of U.S. intelligence assessments, facilitating a fuller understanding of the information that has helped shape major U.S. foreign policy decisions, to cite the publication that's before you, and their relevance for today is only possible if these materials can be contextualized with documentation that demonstrates their provenance and their use and application by the policymaking community. What are the sources for the assessments provided in the most recent release? And when and how were these communicated to decision makers? What were the debates within the agency and within the wider intelligence community about the accuracy and implications of these assessments? What was the reception of these findings on the part of policymakers from the Pentagon to the State Department to the White House? How specifically did they affect policymaking? The documents released by the agency provide some initial answers to these questions, but there's clearly a lot more information that historians and the general public deserve to know to be able to evaluate the work of the agency on these issues. My hope is that today's workshop, in fact, involving some of the veterans of the policy community and specialists on intelligence issues will draw out some of these questions and perhaps provide some initial answers. The Cold War International History Project here at the center has made an effort to, in this larger contextualization of the US materials and the internationalization of Cold War history, through publication, through translation, publication of evidence of documents from the former Warsaw Pact archives. You can go to our website at cwihp.org and download at no charge documents relating to today's subject, including records, Warsaw Pact records that we have published, and of course also let me point to the work by our colleagues at the Parallel History Project in Zurich that have also published some of the relevant Warsaw Pact materials, including Committee of Defense Minister meetings and Political Consultative Committee transcripts. Let me now turn it over to the experts, but not before a recognition and some thank yous. One of the people involved was supposed to be involved in this session and who wrote an essay in the publication, Les Griggs, passed away just a few days ago, and I want to recognize in his passing, and Aris Papas will say a word about Les in just a minute. Let me thank the colleagues at the Information Management Services, in particular Debbie LeBeau and Leo Myers, for their wonderful collaboration. Let me say a big thank you to the Center's senior scholar, Ross Johnson, who really facilitated and brought together, had the idea for this meeting and brought the various players together, shall we say. Let me say thank you to my staff, Tim McDonald, Christina Tertsieva, Pete Bierstecker, and Alison Lilakov, who really helped put this meeting together here today. I also want to recognize somebody who's no longer on my staff, Mircea Munteanu, now at the State Department, who was there at the beginning of planning for this meeting. With that, let me turn to our first panel. We'll have two panels today. The first one, until about 2:30, will discuss the documents, their provenance, and contemporaneous significance. And then a second panel after a short coffee break this afternoon will look at the documents in their historical and historiographical significance. There's obviously going to be some overlap between these panels, and we hope to engage with all of you in a very fruitful, productive, open discussion of the documents and their significance. Joining me on the first panel will be Aris Papas, who is retired from the Central Intelligence Agency 8 years ago, retired as a member of the Senior Intelligence Service. He co-founded Intelligence Enterprises, was a principal for Homeland Security, and served on several strategic review panels, most notably perhaps the two CARE commissions. He's held numerous senior management positions at the agency, both in the analytic and clandestine services, and currently serves as Senior Director of the Microsoft Institute for Advanced Technology in Governments. I'll turn to him first. Then we'll proceed with Mark Kramer, who is the Director of the Harvard Cold War Studies Project and editor of the Journal of Cold War Studies, a longtime close partner of the project and a contributor to it. He's taught at Harvard, Yale, and Brown, He's worked extensively in the opened archives in Russia, Eastern Europe, and several Western countries, and has been a consultant on for numerous government agencies and international organizations. A prolific writer. Let me just leave it at that. We're delighted to have him here today as really one of the leading experts on the subject. That also goes for the third speaker, Wojtek Masny, who coordinates the Peril History Project on Cooperative Security in Zurich, which I already mentioned earlier. He's also a senior fellow at the National Security Archive and co-editor with Malcolm Byrne of a publication that's very relevant to today's subject, A Cardboard Castle, an inside history of the Warsaw Pact. I see he's got a number of documents flagged there, so I think we'll be hearing about that volume. He has taught at a number of universities from Columbia to Boston and SAIS, was a professor of strategy at the U.S. Naval War College and a Fulbright professor at the University of Bonn, and as I said, has as a partner coordinated the Peril History Project for the last several years. So with that, let me turn it over to Aris for some initial remarks, and then to Mark and Wojtek. And then my hope is we'll have some time to take your comments and questions.
Thank you. I was asked to say a few words about Les Griggs, who was supposed to have been here today. Les was a colonel in the United States Army, a Polish speaker, served in Poland as an attaché, and in general, and the most important thing I would say, if the roof was going to fall in 30 seconds, unlike most people you'd normally associate with an Army colonel, was a very kind and gentle man, who all of us who are in this room who knew him will absolutely and positively miss. He was a great person. And he belonged in this story because of the relationship that he developed with Colonel Kuklinski, who is, in fact, the source of a good deal of this material. You were talking about provenance. If you want to learn about the provenance, not my book, and I don't make a nickel from this, so this is not one of those kind of plugs, but there's a book called The Secret Life by Ben Weiser, who's a reporter at the New York Times. It was written in cooperation with virtually everybody who had a significant hand in the Kuklinski operation over the course of 10 years. For those of you that are unaware, Kuklinski provided something like 55,000 documents to the CIA over a 10-year period, most of which was, most of them having to do with the affairs of the Warsaw Pact, Soviet military doctrine, et cetera, things at a very high level. What he was providing us was the kind of context that's usually absent from other forms of technical collection, and quite often from human collection that's far removed from the actual scene of deliberations. Kuklinski was at the center of these deliberations over Warsaw Pact doctrine and so on and so forth. And what we did, the agency, when Colonel Griggs retired, hired Les to work directly with Colonel Kuklinski because his value as a former graduate of the Voroshilov Staff Academy was very high. And so Les continued to work with Colonel Kuklinski in the years following the colonel's departure from Poland and became his close personal friend. They were like in age and they were like in rank, and I think they were alike in temperament up to a point. The colonel was not laid back like Les. But so he deserves reference here, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to have said a few words about Les. I don't have a prepared statement to make. This is, I can tell you, as I said in my memo, which has been printed in this booklet, it's frankly shocking to see this material in the flesh again, because when I was dealing with it, I was a GS 11 or 12 or something like that, and my entire motivation was, don't screw it up, because I had guys like McCacken and Ehrmarth and all that who would yell at me if I did it wrong, and so they and that was a lesson to be learned. Yes, it was. I remember last year we had a panel concerning the martial law material, which I had also worked on, and Professor Kramer said, "Well, why didn't the White House do this?" And I really thought, they did not call me. I was pretty low on the totem pole. But on the question of the wartime statute, this was an issue that came to us because the material had been provided to us by Colonel Kuklinski. And yes, I did have the responsibility to read through it and see what I could make of it. In some respects, it was the hottest material we had, certainly in terms of classification. It was way, way up there. As I said, the last sort of thing I'd expect to see me sitting in a public forum discussing with copies of it Xeroxed in front of me and so on and so forth. On the other hand, I dare say it was not shocking in the sense that it was confirmatory. It was material that put down in black and white what we were all thinking and using as our working assumption anyway, which was the fact that the Warsaw Pact was not an alliance on a single day of its existence. An alliance being a group of aligned states with sovereign rights and interests who are coming together for a common purpose. If you use that definition or anything remotely like it, the Warsaw Pact doesn't fit that. And what came out in the papers that you'll find, certainly more exciting than my paper, which compiles all this stuff. But look through the documents in that CD, and you'll see example after example after example of the Russians simply ignoring the requirements and needs and feelings and sovereignty in no better term of the Eastern European states when it came to the use of their military forces. By virtue of this statute that we're referring to, actually I should ask a question. How many people in this room are aware of the statutes, know what they are? I mean, are we talking to, okay. So we know what they're all about. I mean, what they were all about was an instrument of control that codified the way the Soviet Union would treat a period of war. But I think more importantly, it was they also treated the period preceding war. And that's a critical issue. So they couldn't even make the argument that this was necessary to actually conduct the military operations. They were seizing control in every sovereign way that could be imaginable of the East European forces at a time to be determined by the Soviets, when the Soviets determined that there was a sufficient threat to pull this bell. The complaints by the East Europeans are well documented in this material, and those complaints, you read through them, and again, as I wrote in my memo, you can almost come away with a sense of pity for these people. I mean, they were riding a tiger. They couldn't get off the tiger because it would eat them. On the other line, as long as they stayed on the back of that tiger, they got all the rights and privileges they're unto, they could wear all their stars and bars, they could be generals, they could eat and live in special places, and the whole thing was a fraud from A to Z because they weren't running a goddamn thing. And if there was any problem with that, you could just ask Marshal Kulikov whether he thought he had any allies. I doubt that he believes that to this day. It was pretty much a bullying situation. Let me, I said I wouldn't speak for very long, but I did want to mention a couple of things. The reaction to the paper that was written. The reaction was really kind of interesting. It was for me. I had written the paper and sent it, I went with it to a briefing of the director of DIA, whose name I've been trying to remember. It was Jim something, an Army officer, Army general, very tall fella. Williams, thank you. Very good. General Williams liked the paper. The paper was at such a high level of classification that it really wasn't given a very wide distribution at all, and so I was pretty much dispatched to brief the actual principals. So I went down to see General Williams, briefed him on the paper. He really liked it because it told the story in no uncertain terms. There's no sovereignty. This is how they do it. And I don't mean to cast any aspersions on anybody that was in uniform in this room. I was for 6 years myself. You kind of got the impression when you were briefing our senior officers that, geez, I wish I could do that, Just basically, shut up, go away. I recall briefing General Rogers at NATO. I used to go there every few months to brief him on updates. And one day I walked into his room, and I'll clean this up for you, but you can imagine the words that he used. He was sitting in there in his shirt sleeves in the office, and he said something Greeks. And I knew enough to keep my mouth shut. And he says, no, you f***ing Greeks. And I said, sir, American, CIA, And he just looked up at me, and he was still writing, and he says, people think that I'm the goddamn sack-ewer, and that I'm sitting over here thinking up ways to beat the goddamn Russians in World War III. No. You know what I spend my days doing? Unsticking the goddamn Greeks and Turks, you know. This was not Kulikov's problem. I don't think he had anything pretty much similar to that. Anyway, General Williams liked this, and he said, "Oh, we're going to have to brief this to the bosses." And I said, "Sure, I'd heard that before." I went back to Langley, and a few weeks later, I departed for the Navy War College. I was a student at the War College. I'd been there for about a week and a half. I had two very small children, 6 months and 18 months. When the door opened on my morning seminar, about 10 days into the semester, and this very serious Navy captain comes in, goes to the professor at the front and says, bum, 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 and the professor points at me and says, "Go outside." I was terrified. I thought something was wrong with the kids. I went outside, and this Navy captain said, "What part of my presentation, Mr. Pappas, did you not understand?" The presentation was, if you go to a war college, and some of you in this room have, one of the lectures that you get is, okay, I know you came off the bridge of a ship. I know you commanded USS Enterprise. I know you commanded a brigade, blah, blah, blah. You're not commanding anything here. You're a student. You've left those responsibilities behind. No phone calls from the old establishment. So I said, I don't know what you're talking about. And he flips this piece of paper at me, and it said to the president of the U.S. Navy War College, "Dear Rear Admiral Service, would you release one of your students, Aris Pappas, to brief the Secretary of Defense on such a date?" I said, "I didn't do this." As I wasn't expecting it. "Well, don't let it happen again." So off he goes. The man had no sense of humor. So I flew down, and we briefed Caspar Weinberger. In fact, 4 people in the room, myself and Jim Simon, some of you know him, and the other 2 were Caspar Weinberger and his then military assistant, Major General Colin Powell. So the 4 of us went over this thing. Weinberger was really excited and wanted to use it immediately to bash over the heads of the Soviets, to prove that these guys, were what we'd always said they were, and so on and so forth. And he was so adamant about it that when Jim and I left the Pentagon that morning, we went over to the EOB where we were allowed to have a kind of an emergency session with Director Casey. And we had to tell him that we had just briefed Weinberger on this paper, and Weinberger wanted to release all the information and beat the Russians over the head with it. So we were present in the room when Casey called Weinberger and basically said, "Too high a classification, can't do it, don't do it, et cetera, et cetera." And so Jim and I were little specks on the wall when we were listening to this high-level game of power going on. It wasn't briefed. I went back to the War College, and then the end of this, I think, amusing little anecdote is that about a week later, the same captain comes into the same seminar at about the same time. It must have something to do with the communication schedule, and looks at me and goes like this. Oh, God. So I walk out, and this is what he did. The man had, like I said, no sense of humor. He just looked at me and flips me this paper, which falls on the floor, and then he starts walking away. I bend over, pick up the paper. It was another one of these cables. And it said, "To the President of the U.S. Navy War College, dear Rear Admiral Service, would you release Aris A. Pappas to brief the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff?" So being a civilian and not a lot to lose, I yelled down the corridor at the Navy captain, "Do you want me to say no?" Yeah, he didn't respond. He must not have heard me. Point is that there was significant response to this kind of thing, and that response was at the high level. But in my opinion, and I defer to the scholars in the room who really do understand the nature of how this material was used in the long run. In my opinion, it was, as I said, the word I would use continuously is confirmatory rather than revealing. Confirmatory stuff can be revealing, and this was certainly by seeing it in black and white, but it was confirmatory. I have one other statement that I'd like to throw in, and that's on the other significant document that I think is in this batch on this CD, and that's the reliability estimate. Very few things that I was involved in over the course of 30-some-odd years were as contentious as the reliability estimate. Right, Russ? He and I were involved in this at the same time. And my interpretation of this is a distinction between political needs and objectives and perspectives and purely military needs and perspectives. Basically, the community was asked to put together a reliability estimate because there was some sense following the affairs in Poland and so on and so forth that the Warsaw Pact was coming apart. And it was. There was pretty much Eastern Europe was coming apart. The question was the Warsaw Pact coming apart? And so the question was put to the military analytic community to do an estimate on the reliability of the Warsaw Pact forces. The political side was, the political answer was they were unreliable. The political answer was that based on the events that transpired over the decades prior and the recent events in Poland, that the East Europeans, qua East Europeans, were not a reliable source of manpower and military might. The problem was whether or not we could write an estimate that would go to U.S. military commanders, in effect saying, write off those forces, you don't have to worry about them. And we couldn't do that. Basically, the Poles still had 22 divisions. The East Germans had 15. I get the numbers wrong. Maybe Doug will remember. There were 10 in Czechoslovakia, something like that. That's a lot of divisions. I mean, if they were running around lost on the battlefield, they'd be a problem. And besides, they wouldn't be. What we came to after a lot of debate and discussion was that the East European forces, the Warsaw Pact forces, were at least initially reliable. And what we meant by that was if the bell rang, and the Soviets, by virtue of the wartime statute, would be the ones ringing the bell, the East Europeans would face west and march. And the problem was, not the problem for the Russians, was how far would they go and how long would they last. Now, in that case, as soon as they were bloodied very well or very, very handily by NATO, the chances were they'd crack. What the last successful military campaign by the Czechs was in 17-something, the Battle of White Mountain, or something, I forgot the reference. 16, yeah, there we go. That's a long time ago, you know, that's for centuries. And so the chances of them being a significant player, not so much. The Poles and East Germans, on the other hand, pretty much higher estimation of their military capability. And would they fight or wouldn't they? Well, they pretty much would head out of the barracks because at first they may not even know where they were headed. Secondly, the situation was likely to be concocted in such a way that it would alert their natural instincts. In other words, you want to tell the Polish army to march, just tell them that the West Germans are marching the other way, and they'll go to meet them. But the other factor that we wanted to point out was that for this effect of the East Europeans' lack of military preparedness to be useful, NATO had to be winning. One of the military principles that you don't see often written down, but if you think about it, make a lot of sense, is very tough to surrender to a retreating army. And if NATO was backing up, there was no place for these guys in Eastern Europe to go in terms of surrendering preemptively to the force that's about to surrender to their masters. I mean, think about that logic chain, and you'll see why we couldn't possibly come to a conclusion that these guys were anything but at least initially reliable. Crack them real good, hurt them, and they would necessarily, I think, fold well in advance of some of the others, but not necessarily so, and certainly not in terms of rebelliously, not even ringing, not even answering the bell. So those are the comments that was very contentious and debated hugely at the highest levels because, of course, it's very inconvenient for the political side to accept the military judgment that the Warsaw Pact was at least reliable. So with that, those are my little 3 notes, and I will stop.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this was really helpful. Let me, before I turn it over to Mark, remind everybody that please turn off your BlackBerries. If you don't, the taping of this event will be disturbed. So please turn off your BlackBerries and cell phones. Mark.
Thank you, Christian, and thanks very much also, Christian, for organizing this event, and to Tim McDonald as well, who was involved in it. Again, I'm really glad that these documents have been released. It's still only a small number, and I hope that more will be coming, but I'm glad that they have been released now. Let me say a little bit about, Christian himself, by the way, is a real expert on the Warsaw Pact, and I hope that he too will be speaking later today. But I think that my comments will dovetail somewhat with the speaker after me, who, as Christian mentioned, has really been instrumental in the collection and online publication, as well as in this translations in this volume of former Warsaw Pact documents. So quite a bit of what we're looking at today is already available has already been available in the original. and Wojciech will address that. I'm going to look at a few things about the significance of these, not so much within the U.S. intelligence community. Christian raised many good questions about that we'll want to come back to both today and in subsequent studies. But looking at how information about the general phenomenon we're looking at today, this is a relatively narrow segment of the Warsaw Pact, important but narrow, looking at the command structure that was established for Warsaw Pact armed forces and the ability of the Soviet Union, especially in wartime, to exert control over them. Some of the information about this had been known going back to the mid-1980s. Even the most important thing was an interview that was published with Colonel Kuklinski in the Polish emigre journal published in Paris Kultura in 1986, in which he discussed some of the documents we're looking at today. Even before that, though, John Urechko, who was at DIA then, I think, he might still be at DIA for all I know, but who published an article in the journal Signal, this was in late 1985, and then published a monograph in early 1986 on Soviet coalition warfare, or coalitional as he called it, coalitional warfare. And they didn't explicitly refer to these documents, but his publications were clearly based on having had access at least to some of the information from these documents. He referred obliquely to them. After Kuklinski's interview appeared, then Urechko published another essay in a book that came out from the National Defense University in 1988, edited by Jeff Simon. And there he discussed the documents more explicitly. So some of what we're looking at today had been disclosed going back to that time. We're looking at much more complete versions, and it fills in a great deal. But as I say, quite a bit of this has been known for a while. Colonel General Mikhail Tereshchenko, who was the Chief of Staff and first Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Union's Western Theater Main Command from 1984 to 88, also published an important article in 1993 in the Russian journal Военный исторический журнал, Military History Journal, that gave an overview not only of the structures being discussed here, but also of the restructuring of the Soviet theater commands during the Argarkov period, and looking at the interaction between those new theaters and the Warsaw Pact forces. And so again, he didn't reproduce these documents, but he certainly was drawing on them and had been involved in putting them together. So I say that just to, as a basis, even before some of the documents that were amassed by the Cold War International History Project, by the Parallel History Project, those two projects in particular, even before that, a considerable body of literature had begun to emerge about this general topic. Now, let me ask then, in looking at what these say about the Warsaw Pact, Aris has talked about this a bit. I look on it as compared to what existed prior to these documents. They mostly, to me, seem to formalize and established, especially for peacetime, greater procedural regulations, but mostly to formalize a procedure that was already in place and had been evident in 1968 during the preparations for the invasion of Czechoslovakia and the invasion of Czechoslovakia. The Warsaw Pact, of course, was established in May 1955, and in principle could have been used in the invasion of Hungary in October, November 1956. Khrushchev did have two of the East European countries, Czechoslovakia and Romania, that volunteered, offered to contribute troops to an invasion of Hungary. Khrushchev didn't even consider it, and the Warsaw Pact played no role at all in the invasion, which was basically the status of it at that point. The Warsaw Pact was mostly a paper organization, really until the early 1960s. By 1968, though, it had changed considerably, and in fact, the preparations for the invasion of Czechoslovakia occurred under the commander-in-chief of the Warsaw Pact, Marshal Jakubowski. And if you look at documents attesting to the preparations that were done, they basically are in line with the procedures that are stipulated in these documents, that these documents formalized it, but those procedures were already there. There was, for example, it was a Soviet-dominated process of preparation for the invasion of Czechoslovakia and then the invasion itself. The one difference, though, perhaps, and again, I'm just speculating because the Warsaw Pact during its existence was used only against its own members. It was never actually used against NATO. Preparations, of course, occurred for that, but it has the distinction of being an alliance that was more dangerous to its own members than to its enemies. And if the Warsaw Pact had been used against NATO, perhaps it would have been somewhat different from the operations that were used against its own members. But by and large, it still seems to me that it would have just formalized the procedures adopted earlier. Now, one thing I should note about the invasion of Czechoslovakia, it wasn't actually, when the invasion occurred, it wasn't then formally under the command of the Warsaw Pact. A few days on the 17th of August, Marshal Grechko, Soviet defense minister, convinced the Soviet Politburo to transfer command. The plan had been to have the invasion occur under Marshal Jakubowski as the supreme commander of the invasion. Again, very much in line with what's stipulated in these documents. In the end, at Grechko's urging, command was transferred from the Warsaw Pact to the Soviet High Command, specifically to General Pavlovsky, the commander-in-chief of the Soviet ground forces. And that's the way it was actually carried out. That had nothing to do, though, with, that was mostly because of personal animosity between Grechko and Jakubowski. It really didn't have much to a well-planned change of procedures. And in fact, that kind of last-minute transfer of command resulted in some of the early glitches in carrying out certain things, particularly by way of keeping the Dubček authorities from having to come back soon after they had been arrested. So some of the sloppiness of the invasion was attributed to that. In strictly military terms, of course, it was a rousing success because the Czechoslovak armed forces and state security didn't resist. But as I close, let me just mention, to give an example, though, not only was it the Soviet High Command that took charge of the operation, but even a country that had been eager to take part in it, East Germany, which wanted to send combat troops to take part. Again, at the last minute, the Soviet Union, urged by some of the Czechoslovak hardliners and also by Gomułka in Poland, decided that sending German troops into Czechoslovak soil wouldn't be a particularly good political idea. So in the end, even though the East Germans claimed to have contributed troops to the invasion, they actually did not. It's one of the few cases where a country has voluntarily accepted credit or blame, or however you want to phrase it, for something it didn't actually do. So let me then end by just saying that given what we know about the few instances in which the Warsaw Pact was actually used for combat operations, or at least in the preparations for them, these documents don't seem to me to have changed all that much. The major thing they did do was to put it all down on paper, and that is significant. But the Soviet, as Aris had mentioned, the Warsaw Pact was already a Soviet-dominated organization. And again, these documents consolidated that, but they didn't, in my view, really, they weren't the source of it.
Thank you. All right, I think Wojtek, you're next.
Thank you. Well, I am going to follow my assignment closely and first say something about the provenance of the documents and then about their contemporaneous significance. Collection of the documents goes back into the 1990s, after the Cold War History Project started and collected enormous number of new documents from the former Soviet bloc archives regarding diplomacy, party policy. There was a discrepancy between these documents and documents of military nature. So at that time, I happened to have a fellowship from NATO, the Manfred Wörner Fellowship, and I was able to get for the first time to the NATO archives. In the NATO archives, I met a Swiss colleagues, historian, and we decided that it would be a good idea to make a special effort to get into the military archives in order to write eventually parallel histories of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, hence the name Parallel History Project, which sounds so odd. Yeah? Now, we thought that getting the military documents is important because, after all, the Cold War was always a real war in the making, so it should tell us something. But the problem was how to get into the archives. Many of you may not know that when the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, when the Soviet Union still existed, at Soviet insistence, the member countries signed an agreement not to allow third parties access to the archives. Then the Soviet Union disintegrated, and the question was, should this agreement be observed? I think later on you will hear from Ross Johnson how Poland handled it. My experience was with the Czech Republic. I was trying to get to the archives there in the 90s, to the military archives, and the answer was no. I mean, there is an agreement, no third parties should be allowed. This is off limits. Well, the Czech Republic was trying to get into NATO at that time, and I thought this was outrageous. So I decided to write to the defense minister, and just to mention indirectly, how would it sound if this become known, that the country, the candidate for membership in NATO, is trying to keep secret from NATO the plans or the secrets of its former enemy. But he understood immediately and gave orders. And then we had a collaborator in Prague, a young historian, who then went to the archives after the orders had been issued to open the archives. Well, he came, and the archivist, the director of the archives, was a colonel, former, of course, in the communist army. And he said, well, Mr. So-and-so, here are the archives. They are open to you, and you can be assured that you won't show them to anyone else. So that much for transparency. Anyway, it got underway, and eventually we got actually much more material about the Warsaw Pact than about NATO, because the NATO archives only opened later, and they are still not open for the late 70s and 80s. So oddly enough, our knowledge of the Warsaw Pact archives is much larger. Now, with the qualification, of course, that virtually all these documents are of East European origin, not Soviet, but from the countries of Eastern and Central Europe. We proceeded on the assumption that it was enough of an alliance that most of what was important would somehow be reflected in those East European archives. Well, eventually, we were able to get transcripts of the meetings of the various committees, starting with the Political Consultative Committee, Committee of Defense Ministers, Committee of Ministers of Foreign Affairs. And the result was this collection. It's called the Cardboard Castle. If you are interested in the meaning of the title, that was the way the Warsaw Pact was described by a NATO official at the time of its founding in 1955. It was nothing but a cardboard castle. So we asked the question, well, was it really? Or was it different at different times? Now, I also don't get a nickel from the book, so I can divulge a secret and tell you that the whole book has been scanned by Google, and you can find every page from the book online if you Google the title of the book.
I'm from Microsoft. I'm supposed to say something now, but I don't know what the heck it's about.
Don't. I mean,
That's right.
as a historian, I'm immensely grateful to Google because you can so much see online without having to go to the library, not to mention buy the book. Well, let me tell you what is here and what is not here. It is inevitably a selection. And also, when I edited with Malcolm Byrne, we decided to delete as much as we could what is not important, because it's so repetitive, so boring. Yeah? But we marked the passages, of course, that have been deleted, and moreover, we put online the full text, so that whoever wants to know which passage has been deleted could go to the website of the Parallel History Project and find both the English translations and the original in Polish, Romanian, Hungarian, German, whatever. Yeah? Now, those two documents that we are talking about are included there also. We were able to get the transcript from the East German archives. So the documents we are discussing here are in fact known, are available since 2005. When they are published here, and also on the website. Well, let me now try to reflect somewhat about the contemporaneous significance of those two documents, those statutes. Now, contemporaneous, I suppose, does not mean contemporary, does not mean significance for our time. Because if that were the case, the answer would be happily the significance is none. That's passé. Yeah? Those crazy things that the Warsaw Pact planners and their NATO counterparts were planning are happily a matter of the past. Contemporaneous is something else. The significance within the context of the time, and what can we learn from that. Now, it has been noted, it will be emphasized later this afternoon also, that there is still a lot that we don't know. We have enormous amount of material about maneuvers, but about actual plans that were to be used in case of war, to my knowledge, there is only that one that we found in Prague from 1964, and that has also been published on the website. That's the only one that is really, that would really qualify as a plan to be used in case of hostilities. Otherwise, they are maneuvers, but then I think it's common sense, assuming that the real plan could not have been too far away from the maneuvers, because otherwise the maneuvers would not have made any sense. But the plans are up there in Moscow, and we are not going to see them in the foreseeable future. So that's one piece of information that is missing. But I think there is more that is missing that we should know. And since we really don't know it, we should at least speculate about that. And that is the relationship between the Soviet military and the political leadership. Now, obviously, these statutes were not invented and concocted by the journalists. It had to be done in the cooperation with the political leadership, with the Politburo, something of that significance. If you look at it that way, I think the timing of these two documents is very, very important. One of them, 1969, the other one, 1980. Moreover, the fact that they decided to have two different statutes, one for peacetime and one for wartime. Now, that is not something that would immediately come to one's mind, that one should make this distinction. Nevertheless, the distinction was made. And the first one was the statutes in peacetime. And it was in 1969, the same year, the Soviet Union came with the initiative for the European Security Conference. For the first time, started preparing serious negotiations about the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. So that was one thing that started in 1969, and the other one was the institutionalization, as one would call it, of the Warsaw Pact, to make it a real alliance, including these statutes. Well, as it turned out, what was the Warsaw Pact really good for in the years that followed? Well, of course, it was making these maneuvers, and it was an instrument of control, obviously, of the allies who had been restive only the year before. But I think more importantly, within the context of the time, it was the place where the common policy on the CSCE, on the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, was forged. At the meetings of the Warsaw Pact foreign ministers and at the meetings of the Political Consultative Committee. Now, these were meetings where a real discussion was taking place. It was not just the Soviets telling the East Europeans what to do. For one thing, the Soviets themselves did not quite know what exactly they wanted to achieve with the CSCE, particularly when they encountered initiatives from the Western side. So back to those statutes, I would argue here that the meaning of it was, yes, try to harness the allies, but at the same time don't emphasize war. There were statutes in peacetime. Yeah? So it was the time when the Soviet Union, in fact, was pushing détente. Of course, the understanding of détente in Moscow and in Washington and in Western Europe was different, or in Eastern Europe for that matter. But it was the heyday of détente when these statutes got underway. The first one, that is. Well, let's look at the second one. That's 1980. That is the year after the invasion of Afghanistan. Now, the invasion of Afghanistan is generally regarded by historians to be the turning point on the way to the so-called Second Cold War. The decline of détente and a rising tension between between particularly the United States and the Soviet Union. Now we know from other sources that a fear of war, whether by accident or by design, was real. Much has been written about the Soviet, one would call it paranoia, about the United States preparing a surprise attack. But there is no doubt that there was concern about things getting out of hand, also on the Western side. Now, it was at this point in 1980 that, that the Soviet leadership, for whatever reasons, we don't quite know exactly, decided that a second statute was needed that would be in case of war. And now, mind you, the statute was not made public. It was not a propaganda move. It was kept secret. That is to say, they were really concerned that the contingency might happen, and that they might have to make the pact somehow operational. Now, what is amazing, and of course also symptomatic of the time, is that they did not have their way. The Romanians refused to sign to the statute. So from the very beginning, it was problematic in case the war would come. Not only the Romanians, but perhaps also others would not do what they are supposed to do. So again, I think the second statute is very characteristic of the time of its origin, although, and I would emphasize again, happily it is passé. So this much about the contemporaneous significance.
Thank you, Wojtek. I think that was very helpful. We have just about half an hour for your comments and questions. Since we're webcasting this event, please wait until you have the microphone, and please state your name, and if you like, your affiliation as well. Questions, comments? We'll go first to Mircea Munteanu, all the way in the back.
Thank you. Mircea Munteanu, formerly of the Wilson Center and now at the Department of State. I have actually two questions. One, to follow backwards about the second statute. And
Speak
that
up,
is,
Mircea.
about the second statute, the war one in the 1980. Wojtek had mentioned that it happens at the time when there's the beginning of the Second Cold War. But at the same time, I wonder if you can put this into
Richard,
context.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I was wondering if you can put the second statute into context a little bit, aside from and the idea of the Second Cold War coming. It also happens at a period when the heels of an ascendancy for the Soviet, at least for the Soviet Union and for communist states around the world. It's still. For everyone. Europe. Liability question of. break up the Western Front.
Okay, who'd like to respond?
If you want, I'll quickly summarize the question so that Wojciech and Aris can also respond. The first one was about in looking at the second statute, the one dealing with wartime command, and Mircea referred to this came at a time when the Soviet Union still seemed to be on the offensive and the West more on the defensive. And he was wondering then in that context, why would the Soviet Union have felt a need for it? And his second question was about the actual contribution, if any, that the Soviet Union perceived as necessary from the East Europeans. If push came to shove and say war had come with NATO, would the Soviet Union really have depended on the East Europeans that much? Or would this really have been a predominantly Soviet operation in the guise of a multilateral operation? I think those are the questions, right, Mircea?
You want to respond to?
Okay, okay. So let me quickly then deal with I think each of them. On the first one, see, this is where I don't actually pin this so much on the time because the work on it had begun well before 1980. Certainly by 1977. I would put it in the context more of the general restructuring of the Soviet command in connection with the theaters that were being established, but basically the ascendance of Agarkov is much more what I would pin it on than on per se on the time, even though, again, I think events do influence these statutes. The 1969 statute there's one of these documents that was released that suggests that the 1969 the interpretation offered here of the 1969 statute, I think, is not correct. Basically, a lot of the proposals adopted in 1969 were in line with what Romania had proposed earlier, as well as some of the other East European governments. But in any case, leave that aside. So events do influence these sorts of things, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the pressure or the request by East Europeans and so forth. But I think a lot of it had to do with how Soviet military commanders and the especially important ones thought about structuring Soviet command, the whole high command and the theater commands for war, including war with NATO. On the second question, the invasion of Czechoslovakia could just as easily have been undertaken by Soviet forces alone. And in fact, as I mentioned, that is what was done in the invasion of Hungary in 1956. However, it is very clear from the beginning that Soviet political leaders attached a good deal of political importance to having other countries take part. Again, the Soviet Union's role in that regard isn't altogether different from, say, what the United States has felt in Iraq or Afghanistan, where it had, after initially turning down NATO participation in Afghanistan, has attached value to having other countries take part. The Soviet Union was different in the sense that it had a much more ideological conception of the importance of having the East European countries take part. But in net military terms, the operations could have been conducted. But that's not to say that the East Europeans contributed nothing. There were some of the East European forces that were quite substantial, especially the Polish And even some of that weren't as large, like Bulgaria, could have played a role against Turkey, say. So the East Europeans, again, for the reasons that Aris mentioned, but also in general, the whole thrust of this was to place them in a role in which they wouldn't have the option of being reliable or unreliable. They basically have to go along. That was the whole thrust of Soviet strategy and of these command structures. So.
Okay, those two questions. By 1980, the Soviets were still on the offensive rather than the defensive. I don't think it is the way we should phrase the question. I think what mattered is that détente had been in trouble for quite some time. Certainly before Afghanistan, from the Soviet point of view. Yeah? And one had to be prepared for further deterioration. It is true, as Mark pointed out, that the second statute, the one for wartime, had been under preparation for several years. But so did, I mean, those years coincided with the decline of détente. So I would relate these two things together. What the Soviet Union had depended on the East Europeans. I mean, was the statute needed because the Soviet Union would depend on East Europeans? Again, I would phrase it differently. If, God forbid, war came for any reasons in Europe, the Soviet Union could not ignore its allies, particularly since they had been so troublesome. So there has to be something to control them in case this happens. And that's precisely what the statute is aimed at, to control the allies in case a war comes in Europe. What would one do with them? That would depend on the circumstances, but the control is what mattered.
I want to play with the numbers. I think you asked one question. I think that question has to do with what you were just driving at, and that is, how do the East Europeans fit into this? Why did they have a peacetime statute, not a wartime statute? The other number, I said I would play with two numbers. So I want to reduce your question to one question. And I want to say that there are not just two documents, the statute for peace and the statute for wartime, that are significant here, but there's another document that's in this pile, in this CD, that I think is equally important for study and understanding. And that's a statute having to do with air defense. Yeah. Okay, why? We were asking about context here. The Soviets understood force generation. They understood that they didn't have the time to generate air defense. Air defense had to be integrated at the first instance. So they integrated it, and they demanded and received complete authority over the entire air defense structure from the very beginning, which they did not do for the ground and the naval forces, which I am arguing they would have more time to generate and didn't feel were as significant. Why didn't they feel it was significant? Because of the timeline. The context that I see this thing in has to do with the evolution of concepts for war in Europe. Now, I grant you, détente and all the rest are very significant components of this, but the one that hasn't been thrown in yet is the general staff view of the nature of war in Europe. What was the nature of war in Europe from the Soviet side, and ours for that matter? The general concept for war in Europe in 50s into the 60s was nuclear. What do you need? A bunch of Poles and Czechs and so on running around the battlefield? It doesn't matter, because the war is going to be strategically nuclear from the first few minutes. It really doesn't matter. So you have a peacetime statute that allows you to control these people, offer them the appearance of some degree of alliance and sovereignty. Do you really count on them for battle? No, it doesn't matter. You don't even count on your own forces for that. This is going to be a nuclear war. By the time they started working on the wartime statute, which was well in advance of its actual promulgation, the concept for war in Europe was changing on both sides from one that was decisively nuclear to one that made it safe again for conventional conventional massive forces because theater nuclear weapons had been escalated and masked. Strategic weapons had been escalated and matched. I shouldn't say masked, matched. So the war was going to be conventional again from the Soviet perspective. Suddenly, it becomes very, very important to do something with those 22 Polish divisions, to do something with the 15 German divisions, to do something with the Czech divisions. Those people had to be either engaged or at least out of the way, because I think, as you pointed out, and I didn't hear your actual question directly, this massive second strategic echelon was coming out of the Soviet Union. That second echelon could not possibly afford to step over 22 Polish divisions milling around in Poland. Those divisions had to be out of there. Those divisions were sitting on the military lines of communication that the Soviets were absolutely dependent on to win, in their concept, World War III in Europe. Because it was no longer nuclear, NATO was matched echelon by echelon by the first strategic echelon of Soviet forces plus the East Europeans. The second strategic echelon is the winning hand. They couldn't possibly afford to have that thing disrupted by the presence of East Europeans on the lines of communication. So there is a rationale for the order in which these documents appeared, and it has to do with force generation. It has to do with the general emerging concepts of war in Europe, which doesn't take away a thing from the other issues that are also affecting this. So I'm not setting myself in opposition to my colleagues. What the Politburo had to say, détente, perceptions of threat, all enter into this. But when you look through these documents, read through, look at that air defense document, and you'll see that the urgency for air defense was immediate and apparent well before they felt that they needed it for the rest of these forces, that they would have time to generate, and in any event weren't counting on until later in the game.
Thanks. I'm glad how these three perspectives kind of complement each other quite well. Milton.
I have three very small
Please
questions.
introduce yourself.
Oh, Milton Lightenberg, University of Maryland, Center for International Security Studies. First, how well did books like Chris Jones and Teresa Harmstrom-Rakowski studies prefigure these? Were they more or less on the ball or not? Second, there was a little book published by General Senya from Czechoslovakia after he defected. Is that stuff reliable? And thirdly, Wojtek, you said that the NATO archives for 1970s and 1980s are not available. During the INF turmoil, 2 NATO nuclear planning group secretaries defected to East Germany, if I remember, both to East Germany. Do you folks find, and they supposedly had been passing over nuclear planning group documents for years, did those all go just to the Soviet Union, or do you find those in the East European military archives?
Okay, the last question first. Yes, the NATO plans have been pilfered by East German intelligence. As a matter of fact, as far as we can tell, NATO was an open book for East German intelligence. They could get basically whatever they wanted. They got the cosmic secret documents. Now, we found many of them in East German archives, and they are also on the website, on the PHP website. If you look there, if you look at East German intelligence, you will find them there. Obviously, they were passed on to the Soviets, yes, but they can be found in the East German archives. As far as Shena is concerned, I found most of his statements not verifiable, particularly some of the more outlandish ones. So I think that particularly the longer he stayed in the U.S., the more he was inventing, so that he would still remain interesting. After he had been debriefed by the CIA, he still wanted to write a book. Yeah? So I think he was really inventing a lot. Well, I don't know what happened with him, but he was one of those early defectors in 1968.
Let me deal with just quickly on the NATO. There have been at least some documents pertaining to Able Archer in 1983 released, the various exercise documents, because those documents show that most of the depictions of Able Archer are quite fanciful, and especially the version that quite sincerely Oleg Gudievsky had surmised. It turns out that the version that he was reporting was incorrect, especially about high-level participation and the like. That's not his fault. That's just the information available to him at that time. Let me say, with regard to on the second question, there are now some quite good memoirs available by people who took part in the invasion, especially General Mayorov, who published a very good book that I hope is translated into English. And said he was one of the commanders, not the top commander, but one of the commanders. General Pavlovsky himself gave a couple of interviews. He certainly never expressed a word of regret about the invasion, which in some ways I sort of respect him for that, because I know he didn't regret the invasion. And you kind of have a little more respect for that than for someone who claims to have been a Democrat all along, a la Georgy Arbatov. But, and then on the first question you asked is, what would be that basic interpretation, at least that Chris Jones was placing primary emphasis on the Warsaw Pact as a mission of internal policing, and the preparations for war with NATO is mostly just designed to contribute to that primary policing mission. And again, if you look at the way the Warsaw Pact was used, it's true it was used only against its own members. I think, though, that interpretation discounted far too much the extent to which it was also intended, and in fact its primary purpose was as an organization that would go to war with NATO. It just so happens that the types of contingencies that arose made it an organization for policing within the communist world. But that, as I see it, that was never its primary purpose. There were other ways of dealing with that, again, as the invasion of Hungary showed. So.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes?
I'm John Holstein. I'm Associate Professor of National Security Studies, currently at the American Military University, which is a huge online enterprise. And I've got the most interesting students. They're everywhere from Afghanistan to Southern California, and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. I have two questions. One goes to the question of the implications of the Szabo-Conrad spy ring, which had so badly penetrated NATO's secrets. Did that show up as any reflection of this in this, the documentation stuff that we're talking about here? That's one. The other one is a little more theoretical. Did the Soviets dictate doctrine, military doctrine, to their allies? Were they going to take over command? Were they going to run the German, Pole units and so forth in the event that something broke?
Okay. Iris, do you want to
Yes.
take that?
No, I'm sorry, answer to the first question, no. Answer to the second question, yes. Next question. I don't recall seeing any reference to a reflection of information that they had purloined through any spy rings. I don't recall seeing that in these documents. Others have looked at more of them and others of them than I have, but I don't recall seeing that. I can say, though, that what they did, the documents, these and others, reflected a general view that seemed to be relatively consistent. And those would have been views that were abetted by whatever they collected from agents. The general, this is the biggest sort of generalization you can imagine. In general, the Soviets tended militarily to concede the point where the point was going to be decided by technology, but they defended the point when they felt that the point would be decided by expertise, experience, an old, general staff, and a lot of troops. So the air war was going to be over very fast from their perspective. They were going to have one massive push. They would get what they needed to get done to have the tanks roll, but then the tanks would win. And it wasn't until technology got down to the level that was actually expressed in that book, not Hunt for Red October, Red Storm Rising. The thing that was wrong with that book was they had the Belgians doing it, which seemed a little odd. But what the story of that book is, for every tank you've got, I got an infantryman hiding behind a tree who's going to take the tank out. So when technology went down to that level, it really screwed their plans up. Most of what they would be getting from intel types would be telling them the same thing. I mean, one of the benefits of being an open society is that, to a significant extent, up at the level of doctrine and so on, what was secret about what we were going to do? Nothing. Okay, and that gets to the second question. Yes, I believe that if you look through the documents, specifically read the documents that are even on this CD, you will see specific references to the imposition of doctrine and to the fact that, at least in the Polish case, explicitly complaining about the fact that they were not taking into account doctrinal problems that the Poles would have to face, and it was simply being overridden by the general staff. The structure that's exposed in the wartime statute is one in which the Soviets would assume operational authority at the theater level for East European forces, who would no longer report back to their own general staffs, who would then, the general staffs of the East European forces were relegated to support functions, supply materials, supply trained troops. In other words, they were the materiel command in the background, but the operational authority went from the Soviet general staff directly to a Soviet theater commander, directly to German, Czech, and so on forces in the field.
Thank you. We have time for one final question for this session.
I'm Bernd Schaefer. I'm a senior scholar with the Goldman International History Project. I have a very special question to Mr. Pappas, and maybe everybody else who could answer that. It's about the reliability of the East German forces. I had a talk with a high-ranking former East German general a couple of years ago, and he told me in wartime, the Soviet Union, which had a formidable force in East Germany, about 3 times larger than actually the East German forces, did not trust the East Germans to confront West German units. The West German units had to be taken care of by the Soviet forces in East Germany, but the East German forces were supposed mostly to confront the American forces based in West Germany, because in that case, the morale would assume to be higher in fighting, and the reliability would be higher in fighting the Americans. Have you heard anything about that? Is there any truth to that?
My recollection is that that's generally true. The sectors that were assigned to each one of the East European fronts were sectors that were chosen to at least assist in that kind of a problem. It's not as clear cut as only Germans versus, for example, someplace in the back of my mind, I recall that one part, the Germans were split into 2 different lines, and one of them was going against the Americans, and the other was going against the British. But in either case, you're still right. They weren't going after the Third Corps, which was the German Corps in the center. So I think my recollection is that that's correct.
Yeah, and just to add, I would agree with what Aris has said, but also the NVA also underwent this periodic hate training just in case they did encounter some West German forces. But the but the whole thrust of it, and actually thrust might not be quite the right word, but the whole orientation of it was to have this very rapid thrust that would try to obviate that problem by crushing through so quickly that those sorts of reliability problems wouldn't arise.
Excellent. I think I'd like to bring this panel to a close. Not again without thanking the colleagues for making the documents available. The CA materials for those online viewers, They're also downloadable from the historical collections section on the CIA website. So you can look at the documents there. And I would just ask you to otherwise direct your attention to the Cold War International History Project's website. It has links to all of the collections, Parallel History Project and others, including the National Security Archives, substantial collections that relate to the subject today, and also, I think, the Harvard Project.
And very quickly, I should add, the CIA also on its own website, in addition to the documents that were released today, has a huge collection on its www.foia.cia.gov collection, a large number of ones relevant to the Warsaw Pact.
Nonetheless, the discussion also pointed to some of the shortages, the gaps that remain, not just at the NATO archives in terms of release, but also here. So with that, let me bring this session to a close. Thank our panelists, thank you, and we'll take a 15 minutes or so break, and then Ross Johnson will chair the next session. Thank you.